Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Wim van Dijk, and I'm a technical specialist with the pre-sales organization here at SailPoint. And today I'll be showing you how you can quickly and easily create your own user interface into Identity Security Cloud. Here's what we will be discussing today. I'm going to give a quick overview of what we're talking about. I'll point out the components that are used or the requirements that you'll need, and I'll do a walkthrough of the code of this project as it comes out of the repo, and I will do a little demonstration on how to create your own elements in a custom user interface. So obviously Identity Security Cloud comes with a great and modern web interface and is itself a client of SailPoint APIs. Now, once you're familiar with those APIs, you might have ideas on how to interface with the underlying governance system or add a particular business flow that doesn't come out of the box, but maybe you're not sure how to do this. So that's exactly what this demonstration is for. In this demo, I will show you how easy it is to quickly set up a custom web application that interfaces with Identity Security Cloud, giving you the power of the SailPoint APIs and the underlying Atlas platform to create your own experience. Because the real power lies in the APIs themselves, and because SailPoint offers you several SDKs, giving you easy access to these APIs in the language of your choice, it's really not all that hard. So here's the components that I used to build this example. And you'll notice it's just that, it's an example. The real power is in the usage of the SDKs, and you're of course free to use any framework you're familiar with. So first off, we're using Python, as you could guess from the title. I used Python 3.14, but anything above 3.11 will do. We're using Shiny for Python as the React framework for the UI elements, and Starlet as the underlying web server. Again, of course, you can change any of these, with anything that you're familiar with. And of course, the real star of the show is the SailPoint SDK for Python. And that's really all I have with slides. So let's jump into an overview of the code and then a demonstration of how we can use this. Let me just get this PowerPoint out of the way. All right, so here I have a freshly checked out version of the repo. This code will be made available to you all. So as a requirement, you'll need to have Python. You'll need to be familiar with Python. And of course, you'll need to have access to a working tenant. And one important point here is you will need to have created an API token, specifically using the authorization code flow for OAuth. So in that way, you can connect your application to the tenant, and then the end user can authenticate them as themselves and use the proper scopes and authorization. So once we have that, all we need to do here is check out our code. Then we will create a Python virtual environment and then activate the virtual environment. Then from here on, we can just pip install all our requirements. So we're using a Py project. This is going to download and install all of our requirements. While this is running, we can set up our .env, right, where we specify the configuration of the connection to the tenant. I'm just going to copy that over here. All right, so now this is all connected, and once this is all installed, we should be ready to run our application. So we can do make run or just run Python run.py, and if all the requirements have been installed, and in a second this should start up our little application. All right, so yeah, we're starting a UVcorn as the underlying HTTP server, and if we now quickly check our local host, all right, so our application is running. So let's have a little walkthrough on how this is constructed. Right, so we have our main entry point in run.py. This calls the main method, which just launches a UVcorn little web server that launches the create app method, which returns a Starlet application. So again, and I'll be repeating myself, the main magic will be done by our own SDKs. Anything around it is just, UI framework that you can, pick and choose for yourself. So here we return a Starlet application with 3 routes. One for the OAuth callback, so that is the one that you will use to authenticate your end user. There's an API auth route that makes sure that we have an active and valid session, and it will refresh the session when needed. And then we have the main route that calls the Shiny app, which is imported from the app.py. So that is really our main application. What's particular about Shiny is that it works with components, and then each component has a UI module and a server module. And we'll get to that in a second. So the first thing we'll do when we load our app is we re-register all the different components here. So we create our own registry, which in the end is just going to be a list of available components, which makes it really easy to just iterate through them and then display them and work with those. So out of the box, we just create a few example ones for identities, accounts, and a search functionality. So that's what you see right here, right? Identities, accounts, and search. And we have some cards that give you some access to that as well. Then the main app in the end, like any Shiny component, uses a UI module and a server module. The UI module will in the end just define the structure of the HTML of the page, and then the server module defines how you load the data that you put, enter into that HTML. For the main app, this will just call it basically have your the top navigation header, and then anything that comes below it, and then that will be defined by the component servers themselves that you attach in this way to the main application component. So then we have our components, right? The ones that we have registered at startup of the application. So we have one for identities, one for accounts, and one for search. And then again, here we'll see that we have some helper methods, mostly for styling and pagination. So we will see again, we have a UI module outlining the HTML and the styling of the page itself. And then we'll have a server module that defines how we fill in the content of that UI structure. So what we will do here is we will fetch a list of rows, which will be the data that we will display and put in a data frame that will be transformed into a table. The rows themselves are just calling our client, which we will get to in a second, which, as I said, is the real magic, doing the heavy lifting using the SDKs. So we will need a method search identities, right, that returns a list of rows, and they are then rendered into basically a pandas data frame that turns into a table, right? And then similar for the other components. And then there's one last one, which is our home page, which basically brings everything together. And then last but not least, we have our client. So again, this is where all the heavy lifting happens. So this is where we make use of the SailPoint APIs, right? And the SDKs. So here we just create some helper methods that directly call the SDK APIs and methods for any component that we want to use. So the real trick in the end is you create the methods that fetch the data or create things that you want to implement yourself, and then you call those methods in whatever UI framework elements that you define. So in the end, what that looks like is we have a simple interface here with some links into the components. These cards are just examples of a little, extra UI element. So if we click on the identities, it will load the identities, and we can even have a little modal where we look at some details. All right, so this is nothing earth-shattering. We're just listing some data, and of course, this information is readily available in the tenant itself. So let's see now how we can create our own component. So in the end, like as we said, there's 3 steps into adding a component. So first is you create the component itself, right? You create the component Python file with your UI layout and then the server module that fetches the data for you. Then we register that component in the component registry, and then we connect it to the main application in the app.py file. So let's go ahead, and as an example, we'll create a component that allows us to view and possibly create roles ourselves without using the ISC out-of-the-box UI. So let's go ahead and start by creating that roles component file. I'll just quickly copy paste. You don't want to watch me type 60 lines of code here. All right. So again, it's very simple. We start with a UI module, right? We have a header. We have a row with a few columns in it. And then in the end, we will have a data frame that was basically a table calling this roles table method that we will define in the server module. So if we look at our server module, right, we have this roles table that fetches these rows, and then again, this is where the heavy lifting happens, which is done by the client. The client is going to execute a method list roles, which we'll have to create. That returns a list of rows, and each row will represent a role, an ISC role. And then here we can, when we iterate over those, we can grab whatever information we want from each role, and then display those as a data frame, which will become a table. So the next step is going to be to add that list roles method in our client. So let's go in there, and then we start by importing the classes that we need. So we're going to use the role model. So we'll import the role class, and similarly we're going to use the roles API. So not models, but API, roles API, import roles API. All right, so now very similar to what we do with identities. So let's just copy paste that and then take it from there. So we'll just add a section for roles here. We're going to list roles. List roles. Now for the roles API has a limit of 50 maximum, so we'll have to adjust that here. We're going to return a list of role objects. We're using the roles API, and we're calling the list roles method within that API. And then we can also, just in case we want to use that, have a method to individually call a single role ID, returning a role object using the roles API. Calling get role. And we can even implement a search method, which itself will not use the roles API, but just the normal search API. And then, of course, we limit ourselves to the roles index. Then the third step, so we created our component, we created the helper methods that are used in the server module of our component. So now we just have to connect it to the app, which we do in our app file. So we first have to make sure we import that from components, roles, import roles server, and roles UI. And then we just attach it to the app at the bottom with the other components. So roles server, roles client. We pass it to client so that it can use that, and we should be ready to use our new component. I think one more thing, we want to make sure it has the correct icons. Icons are bundled in a list here, so let's do that here. So we make sure we want to list the component in the page. So that's we call the roles UI method, and in the icons map, and that's just to give it a corresponding icon. Because it's a role, we're gonna give it a nice D20 dice. And then we do the same thing for the home page, and that's just to make sure that the icon is displayed. Dice D20. All right, so our server should have noticed these changes and is restarting itself. And let's see what happens when we refresh this. Notice I was not prompted for an authentication page. That's because I had an active session on my tenant. So if the session was not active, I would have been forwarded to the login page to perform OAuth authentication. And it looks like I may have missed something, because it is, oh, I did not register the component. There we go. That was supposed to be one of the first steps. So In here, we have to add this little bit. So we register this component in the registry of components. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we have now an extra tab in our header, and then an extra card, and then this lists all of our existing roles. All right, so, and again, nothing spectacular. We're just doing a get. We're listing some existing roles. Nothing earth-shattering. We're just listing information that is readily available to us. So why don't we go ahead and let's add a little form here so that we can create a role. Again, it will be very simple, but just to show you that at this point, you're in charge of the flow of your application. You are connected to the tenant. You're using the SDK, so you can pretty much do what you want at this point. So let's add a little form where we can create a role. And that way, perhaps, you can allow business application owners to manage those roles without having to grant them any ISC admin privileges. Right? So let me go back into the roles component. And again, I'm not going to type out this whole file. So what we added here, when we look at the UI module, so the first bit is the same. We add a header, a few columns. We're going to ask for a name and a description. We'll display a list of sources from which to filter the entitlements. Then we'll use a button to load the entitlements for the chosen source, and then from that drop-down list, we'll pick which entitlements. So we have a few helper methods that will list the sources and the entitlements, and then create a little table, and then perform the post to create that role. Which means we will have to also add the helper methods to our client. So again, let me just open the client and add those in there. I'm just going to copy paste the whole file. So the only thing we added here is a few methods to list our sources, where we just use the sources API. Again, from here on, if you're familiar with the APIs and the SDK, it is in the end quite simple. So we're listing entitlements for the source, and then we do a create role, which is doing a create role API endpoint, and we will add the current logged in user as the owner. Obviously, this is just a simple example. This, you can expand this to however to your needs. Because we need to grab the owner, which will be part of the session, we do need to add one more thing. So when we connect the role component to the application, we pass it a client, but now we also need to pass it the user session, so we know who is logged in, so that the logged in person can become, so we can fetch the identity of the logged in person, and that can become the owner of the role. And I think that's all we need. Let's go ahead and refresh. So here you see this is the part that we added. Again, this is a very simple form, but just to show you how easy it is to add just the bits and pieces that you need for this. So that's my own role, my roles description, being very original here. And this is an actual list of the sources that we just fetched. Let's use Active Directory and then load the entitlements. And we're just going to grab some random groups here. And if all went well, we should now have created a role. So let's quickly jump into the tenant and look at the roles. I have here my own role with my roles description containing 2 entitlements. Again, a fairly simple example, but I hope this shows how you can now, you can create the app in any way that you want, using the framework that you want and using any logic that you want, and hand it out to anything that is appropriate to use this functionality. So that was one way to add a component, right? We manually added a component file. Under components, we created the necessary methods in the client using the SDK, and then we connected it to the app in the app file. Now, another possibility would be when you're using something like VS Code or Cursor or any other IDE that has an AI assistant, the repo contains a skill to add a component. So if you're not familiar, skills are tools that you can give to your AI assistant, basically, that you might use for your code development. And it will contain a set of detailed descriptions, instructions matching a certain description, and it will figure out if what you're asking matches the description. It will perform whatever you have defined in that skill. So in this case, we pretty much spell out all the things that we did, right? If we ask it to add a component, it's going to check the existing components, it's going to check the contents of the app file and the client, and then see if there's anything that needs to be done. If it needs to create a component, we're telling it use this pattern of code, and some placeholders, and then tell it just to instruct it to patch the app file, and then it should do everything independently. So let's just see if that works. And I'm just going to open, in my case, Claude code here on the side, and I will ask it to add another component to look at the existing certification campaigns, right? So all we have to do is ask it, add a certification campaigns component, use a campaign model and API, so not the certifications model, and use any Python skills that you may have as well. So it should quickly discover, there you go, that there is a skill available called add component, right? So now it's going to start going through all the instructions in the skill. It's going through the existing app file, the existing client. Now it is checking the actual SDK for existing methods and models, and then hopefully deducing what it needs to do with that code to perform what I just asked. And let's give this a few seconds or a minute while it is thinking and clouding and contemplating. And I'm really curious to see if it will work right away, because I do know that there's a little quirk with the campaigns model, is that you would think that a campaign contains a list of certifications, but it actually doesn't. It contains a special inner model, and I'm curious to see whether it's going to be able to figure that out or not. So we can tell that it's going through the actual SDK files. It claims to have everything it needs, and it is creating the components. and then it should add it to the application and create the client methods. It's now just cleaning up some import warnings, and I think we should be about ready. So here we see that it is connecting the server module to the application module. So, all right, verifying. So I believe we are done. Let's just wait for verification. Here's a summary. So it created a new component, new file. It added a list campaigns method in the client, and then registered the component in the app and connected it to the app server module. Let's go ahead and see enable via settings campaign. Let's see if it is enabled or not. All right, so we do see a new tab for campaigns, so it looks like it is enabled. And when we list, we see the correct. I know that this is the correct number of rows, but I believe we're hitting the issue that I was wondering whether we would hit it or not. So let's see if we tell it if it will figure that out. What's interesting about these AI agents is that in my dry runs, sometimes it will figure it out without me telling it to, and sometimes I just have to ask it, and usually it figures it out pretty quickly. So to be fair, I was making it a little hard on the agent. I could have picked an easier model, but I thought it would be a more interesting experiment or exercise. And there we go. Yeah, so it's figuring out that each campaign object actually lives in another inner object. And let's see if that made any difference. There we go. So those are two ways that you could easily create your components. You can do it manually and you have full control, or you can use an AI assistant and just use a skill. Of course, you can always adjust the skill to any details that you want to add, or things you may want it to do differently. But I hope that shows that it was quite easy to create your own UI models for things that might not either be easily available out of the box, or you don't want to hand out administrative privileges to end users. And so this would be a way, for example, to look at audit events. Just one example, that you might want to create a special UI for your SOC team or for any auditors. In any case, I hope this was helpful to you, and I'll see you in the forums, and thank you for your attention.